It's been a little longer than 3 years since my big video covering all the anime adaptations that existed during that time for the works of Junji Ito. Since that video, we haven't been given the adaptation for Uzumaki yet, but instead we've gotten something unexpected. Another anthology anime of his stories. What's even better is that Junji Ito Maniac was made by the same studio that made the Junji Ito collection. Since I know how people react towards the Junji Ito adaptations, I wanted to see how well they fared compared to their original versions. Whether it's bad, good, or even better than the original, I just had to see if the season was even worth watching considering it adapted some of the more popular stories that even the most casual viewer has probably heard of. On my initial watch of Junji Ito Maniac, I honestly thought it was good. It didn't seem like anything was wrong, and at the time, I was going off of my memory because I have read a lot of these adapted stories before at some point in time. However, after I've reread their respective manga chapters to make this video, I came out with a slight change of opinion, albeit not that large of a difference. Some stories I liked even better in this anime, but there's some that I questioned why they were even chosen for this, and there's one story in here that I think should never have been made to begin with. To change things up a bit, I'll start this video off by talking about the best of the adaptations and work my way to the worst. This way, you'll get to experience how making this video felt in real time as you realize how many small problems in this started to add up. It's ironic that I found myself going through my own descent into madness while making this video. Long Hair in the Attic is, without a doubt, the best adaptation within Maniac. Everything that happened in the manga was done better in this anime. The really great thing was that they added a bit more detail to the start of this chapter to flesh it out and fix some of the faults within the original chapter, as it gives a proper reasoning behind the events of what happened, while also making it where the viewer can find their sympathies in the protagonist of the story a lot easier. She doesn't feel as wooden in the anime, and the ex-boyfriend was turned into more of a believable playboy than the manga would have you to believe, which is ultimately what helps the story the most. The original version of the story was just bizarre, and it left you with more questions than anything. But the anime's version gives you a sense of closure, as it felt like some things were answered while leaving out just enough questions to keep the original mood of the story. Toontown was very close to a perfect adaptation. The only difference between the versions was just the protagonist going back to the town at the end, but both versions ended the same exact way. This is one of the adaptations I can't really talk too much about because it's just that close to the source material. You can only glean slightly more information about the situation since you can hear the protagonist's inner thoughts, but that's really all there is left between the versions. Next, we have the adaptation of Ice Cream Bus, which is, for the most part, pretty great. There's only 2 differences that it had from the manga, and they're both relatively minor. The adaptation didn't properly show the time that took place during this story, as this was over the span of several months, and the most disappointing part is just how they didn't show the ice cream man aggressively staring down Sonohara throughout the short story for no particular reason. Overall, this story is just purely an uncanny one, and the anime managed to capture that pretty well, even with the horror imagery of ice cream children toned down by a noticeable degree. The thing that drifted ashore was more or less the same as its manga counterpart. They removed like one part that just feels like it exists to make the story seem a lot more confusing than what it is. And also the ending made it feel a bit more complete while not messing with what makes the original version a good story. There's really nothing of note about this one outside of that, which is unfortunate considering it's one of the best of the season. Intruder, also known as Tresspassers, is an adaptation. I can't really say anything negative about it in comparison to its manga because they essentially adapted it one-to-one. By definition, it is not a bad adaptation, but I also can't say anything positive about it either, but that's more because of subjective reasons. This story is just one of Junji Ito's works that I find to be bad, so I can't really get all that excited about how well adapted this one was. It's just a boring story from start to finish. 4x4 Walls is the first of 2 Souchi stories in Maniac, and it's arguably one of the best ones from his series. Fortunately, it's also one of the better adaptations from this anime. Everything in it happens the same way as in the manga, except for a single thing. The Carpenter's introduction is different. Though this might sound like a bad change, it actually doesn't really affect anything, as the Carpenter wasn't important to the story, and the way the anime handles it actually made him more suspicious than he was in the manga. Honestly, his introduction scene in the manga derails the pacing of the story, so this is one of the changes that I'm in favor of, as it removes all distractions from its flow, and it makes that character come off even creepier as a byproduct. The strange Hikizuri siblings is referred to as the Seance in its manga version, and I think it's the second story in its series. While this adaptation is good because it follows almost everything perfectly, there were definitely some parts that could have been better. The only thing that really impacts the adaptation is very minor things that, when put together, makes you enjoy it a little less than the original chapter. The biggest downside of this adaptation is how you lose out on information regarding Hitoshi, as it's shown early on that spirits are drawn to him in the manga, and this aspect isn't relayed that well within the anime, as you only know this at the end of the episode. There wasn't much new to this adaptation, but what was added ultimately fleshed out the characters more than the original manga chapter. Some of the awkwardness in their dialogue felt more natural, and had more emotion put into the writing than the original version, which was very beneficial to the pacing. One thing that you can note is that a lot of the framing compared to the manga is different within this adaptation, but that doesn't really affect anything. I wanted to put this out there, not that it matters or anything, but because there is a non-0% chance that someone decided to write this adaptation off because of that alone. Whispering Woman is one of Junji Ito's stories that I've always been pretty fond of, and I was very happy to see this one getting adapted. I personally consider it one of the best stories that he's written, and you can definitely feel it through this adaptation. Between the versions, the biggest change is just minor dialogue omissions for the more redundant parts of its writing. A lot of the other differences that it had were arguably for the better though, as they helped the presentation for it overall, and you could find yourself easily immersed with the new addition of a very faint whisper track whenever the main characters were on screen. The only part where my praises for this adaptation shifts is at the end of the episode. The new changes it had were great, but it would have been way better if they kept the eerie factor of Mitsu's spirit being acknowledged by the family, and the father noticing how it was changing his daughter. The new scenes worked so well with the original story, and this could have been the best episode in the entirety of Maniac if it were done right. Despite Library of Illusions having probably the most differences between the adaptation and its source compared to the other stories, I don't think it's a bad adaptation in the least, which I know sounds a little wrong when we're talking about accuracy here. The most significant part that was changed was some details with the ending, but that didn't affect the story overall because the source material itself was just as confusing. Other than that, they only took out some of the protagonists' inner thoughts, which are very redundant in this story, considering a lot of this seems to be repeated with basic dialogue between the characters. This is a weird one for me because, ultimately, the changes just don't affect anything with the story, even when you think they would. The Sandman's Lair isn't the best adaptation, but I also wouldn't say it's a bad one either. In terms of its differences, the adaptation removes a single scene from it. That might sound minuscule, but it managed to affect way more than you'd think. The scene in question details the rough amount of time that the main couple spends together fending off the monster of the story, and explaining the degree of pain that they went through while trying to avoid the inevitable threat. That scene alone is what makes Yuji give up on fighting with his other self and accepting his loss. What makes this adaptation not negative, however, is how the anime handled the threat being presented. The manga scene introducing Yuji's other self doesn't do Junji Ito's art any justice. In fact, it's probably one of the worst looking things that he's ever drawn due to how it was obscured. The anime gave it a central focus when it gets shown, and it makes Yuji's other self feel more like a threat rather than something you'd more than likely just laugh off. How well they presented this managed to balance out the adaptation a little, but it doesn't completely excuse it, as the pacing for the story definitely suffered a little. Adaptation-wise, I can't say that Souchi's beloved pet is bad, but it is a story that just felt like it was missing something. It is a perfect adaptation, but I feel it's one of those Junji Ito stories that are carried by the art style. The major point of the story is that you see a cat get progressively more disheveled and creepy throughout it, but it just doesn't work for this adaptation because there wasn't enough budget to reproduce that feeling. The silver lining of this, however, is that there were some choice scenes within this episode that were done significantly better in terms of presentation, but that's really the only good point I could give it on that front. Photograph, one of the Tomie stories, ended up pretty decent. There's just 3 pages from the start of the chapter missing that continued from the previous Tomie story, and some relatively minor differences with the protagonist. Other than that, it's exactly the same as the chapter, just in a 4:3 ratio. Out of all the adaptations in this anime, I feel like Headless Statue is in the middle when it comes to whether it's good or bad. It isn't one-to-one like some episodes that came before it, but it is oddly enough one of the only ones in this season that changed stuff but ultimately did not affect the story at all. The adaptation messed with the timeline of events a little, which is a strange choice for an already short manga chapter, but those same changes still ended up on par with the original. A lot of that is probably due to this being one of Junji Ito's earlier works, and honestly, the story to this one is just really bad to begin with, even if it's a good concept. Because of the subject matter of the hanging balloons, I'm gonna go over this as briefly as I possibly can. This adaptation included everything that was in the manga outside of the really obvious inner thoughts of Kazuko at the start of the episode. At the very worst, this one was just okay. It didn't cut out anything, but it also didn't add to it like the other stories. The only thing that they did with this one was change up the pacing, which leans the quality of this adaptation towards the bad side, which is disappointing considering that this is one of the more well-known stories of Junji Ito's. Alley is where we start getting into adaptations that I find it hard to say good things about. It has some very noticeable revisions to its writing compared to the manga, where entire lines of dialogue are different, but are generally not too dissimilar from it. This one would probably lean towards the good side of things if it wasn't for the fact that this adaptation almost completely got rid of the father that's mentioned in the story. And what's worse is that the adaptation changed what the father's ghost says that alludes to things that would happen later in the chapter. The biggest difference is the payoff at the end of the episode, but both versions still leave things obvious to what's about to happen. Outside of that, everything in the episode is mostly the same as the chapter. While this adaptation just barely made it onto the bad part of the list, the unfortunate truth is that from here on out, things will only get worse. Mold is not a very good adaptation, but the bright side is that it's just a tiny bit worse than the previous one. This story is one of Junji Ito's gross-out stories, but unlike Glyceride, the art for this one just doesn't do it justice, even when its subject matter by default is pretty disgusting. For some reason, the backstory for it wasn't explained in great detail, so the horror for this adaptation comes off as confusing because of it. The manga very clearly lays out where it originates from, but the anime only vaguely hints to it, which makes it feel like they purposely left things out for the viewer to speculate about if they've never actually read its source. Unendurable Labyrinth is a strange adaptation, to say the least. It's almost exactly one-to-one, but the parts that are missing heavily affect it, which makes it into a bad adaptation. The even stranger thing is how the anime version is actually longer than the manga chapter, yet somehow cuts out a backstory that explains why this entire chapter is even taking place. The added visuals do a good job at trying to portray what the chapter was showing, but it just gets worse towards the end because that backstory was integral for the ending to even make sense to begin with. If they just simply took out that the main pair got lost in the mountains, that would be fine, as it didn't affect anything, but sadly that's just not what we got. It's a shame too, because the anime version of this wasn't a bad watch compared to the others this far down the list. Right off the bat, I could tell that the story of the mysterious tunnel wasn't that great of an adaptation. In the source material, this tale starts off with the protagonist recalling 20 to 30 years in the past, and that part isn't in the anime at all. After that, the rest of the story is marginally the same in the adaptation, but the things that were different negatively impacted it by quite a bit. For instance, in the manga, the protagonist and his friends are having their test of courage in the tunnel. They're talking about the rumors surrounding the area and paint a really vivid picture of the horrors that have happened there, and it causes them to freak out upon seeing Mari, the protagonist's sister. This moment in the anime is there, but the dialogue was altered to the extent that it comes off almost confusing as to why they're scared of spotting Mari outside of just being caught off guard. The adaptation also gave the story a completely different ending, since they cut out the future bits about the protagonist returning to his hometown to be devoured by the tunnel. The other aspects of this adaptation was on par with its manga, which just makes it that much more disappointing. It had potential to be among the best adaptations in the anime, but ironically was one of the worst because of how important the story aspects they cut out were. Bully is, without a doubt, the worst adaptation of the entire collection. Like many of the other stories, this one's adaptation cut out a bit of the start, but it does it in such a terrible way. The protagonist of the story is telling someone about her past in the manga, but the anime skips to the start of that story and doesn't give any indication that it's a retelling of the past until the episode's almost over. To make matters worse, the abuse that the protagonist dishes out feels somewhat censored because of how it's handled. It's almost adapted the same way, yet there's crucial information that's shown through how the protagonist tells the story, and the anime hides the fact that this is a lot darker than what it is because of how this was framed. It even goes as far as to show the male lead in this story with really terrible scars on his throat that aren't even seen in the manga. It really makes me question what the point of them adapting this one was when they essentially threw out half of an already short story. The only good part about this is that the anime's art is way better than the manga chapter, but that's just basically me giving it pity at this point. There's one more story that I decided to leave out of this list, and you're going to find out why really fast. In fact, this story is the entire reason why I disappeared from my channel for so long. It mentally drained me by the time I'd finished writing its segment, and I just wanted nothing to do with this for the longest time. So, without any delay, enjoy my mostly unedited words I had for this one. Now, I couldn't include this with the others because I wouldn't feel right since it goes all against the original intention I had for this video. The adaptation for Layers of Fear is almost exactly one-to-one. So much so that I objectively cannot say that it's a bad adaptation. The only differences between the two versions were really just minor art things. That's all I have to say for the adaptation, because I have a much bigger problem with the chapter that it's based on. This one in particular I feel is among Junji Ito's worst works because it just doesn't feel complete to begin with. The fact that this story is so well adapted just makes me need to talk about how much of a missed opportunity this chapter is. From a horror standpoint, it's one of the better horrors that he's done because it's so very unnerving as it gets close to the end, but from a writing standpoint, it just doesn't feel like something he even wrote. If this were more than a one-shot, it could have been fleshed out into being potentially better than Uzumaki. Please forgive me because I know this isn't very charitable to Junji Ito as a whole, but the very basic skeleton of the story goes like this. There's a cool intro setting up a problem, the horror later gets hinted towards, creepy shit happens, and then it just ends without any proper conclusion. I know there are some chapters even within this anime that follow a similar formula, but this entire thing is just so unfulfilling. It feels significantly less developed than his other stories that take on the same structure. Those may be similar, but they end up leading to a conclusion that feels correct, even if it was one of his bad stories. This is an inherently flawed story because it's very clearly supposed to be one of his pure body horror stories, but I was much more interested in how dysfunctional the family was. I would have had a completely different reaction to this if the story focused more on that part, because it would have complemented what was already there. The dynamic that I found really interesting about this only happened towards the end of the story, and that's just tragic. There was so much more that could have been done, but it ended up settling for less. I really hate this story, because Junji Ito has done better with worse concepts. And that was Junji Ito Maniac. I find it strange that there was next to no one talking about this series over the months that I've been writing this. After having this on my mind for the greater part of a year, I feel like the criticism that was attributed towards the Junji Ito collection works way better when talking about this one. There was only a small handful of stories adapted in this one that I could say were good and had nothing wrong with them compared to the last one. For a lot of these, I did my best to find the good points in them so I could try to be as objective as possible, because I really dislike people being uncharitable about adaptation work because of how nuanced the topic really is. Trying to find the good in a lot of this really drained me of my motivation because, as you can see, there is really nothing good about the last couple of stories that I talked about. The last good point that I can give to this anime is that I really enjoyed the preview segments between the episodes. They were handled as their own original story across the entire season, and it was a thing I ended up seeing as my sanctuary at the end of the really bad episodes. Hopefully the next time you see me talking about Junji Ito, it will be for the Uzumaki adaptation, but I'm not really looking forward to that because of how things seem to be shaping up. Stay tuned for that eventually, but I hope it'll take some months before it comes out so I can give my brain a break. If you want to follow me in other places, I have links to my Twitter in the description as well as my Discord server if you want to talk to me and my tiny community. With any luck, I can get my next video out in record time.